Good afternoon, everyone. This is the SleuthKit Labs Cyber Triage release webinar. We're going to talk about some MemprocFS, some S3, and a bunch of other cool things. We'll give this another minute to folks to pop in, and I'll pass it over to Mike. All right, that about does it. So I'm Brian Kerr, CEO at SleuthKit Labs. Welcome again. This is the webinar we are doing about some of the cool stuff that we did in the most recent release. But you're not going to see much of me today. You have the pleasure of hearing from Mike Wilkinson, who's going to talk through a bunch of the things around MemprocFS, S3, I think some sandboxing, a whole bunch of other kind of stuff. So everyone is muted. Usual webinar style now. I feel like we're probably old school now with kind of with everyone knows these kind of things now. So there is a questions tab. As Austin just kind of chimed in there. There's a questions tab. Plug whatever questions you have throughout this. We'll go through those either during it or at the end. And then there's some other folks around here who can help out, answer questions and such. So with that, take it over, Mike.
Great, thank you, Brian, and thank you everyone for coming along to hear the latest and greatest about cyber triage. So, as Brian mentioned in this session, sort of the two key features that have been added or enhancements to cyber triage for 3.13 release. Memory ingest, we're now using MemprocFS in addition to volatility for memory ingests, which means we get much better support for more recent operating systems. We also have the ability to add hosts directly from S3 and Azure and any other cloud platforms that are using the S3 protocol. So that's really cool. You can run the collector, collect directly from the host, upload it to S3, and then from within Cyber Triage, just browse everything that's been put into the bucket and automatically add it into Cyber Triage. We've got a few malware scanning enhancements. We've got some changes to artifacts and scoring, and a few little tweaks to the user interface and search. As Brian mentioned, you can ask questions. Please do ask questions. If you see anything here that you would like more information on, please do let us know, either in the chat or in the question tab. I'll be keeping an eye on that. We've got other people in the background that'll be keeping an eye on that as well, and we'll endeavour to answer any questions you can put to us. So we are going to go through the enhancements we have made to 3.13. Just as a reminder, this is all documented, docs.cybertriage.com, history section number 20 now, and you can go through and see all the updates if you want to read it, rather than listen to my wonderful accent. So starting off, MemprocFS. So advantages of MemprocFS, as I said, it supports much wider range of operating systems, a bit faster processing and volatility, some better handling of large memory dumps, and we still have retained support for volatility too. Adding a host or adding a MemprocFS memory capture, exactly the same as adding any other type of memory image. Except when you go to add that memory image, you will now see that you get an option to choose MemprocFS as the source. Once it's in and added, you'll get to go through and obviously we process all the different artifacts from the memory. We apply all the scoring rules. One of the nice things about MemprocFS, in addition to our own scoring rules, we also use the find evil functionality, which is actually built into MemprocFS. And so you get a bunch of additional rules in there, mix of some Yarrow rules and a few other interesting things going on. So you're still going to get a bunch of additional scoring items or additional scored items in there when you are working on your memory images. In addition to that, Obviously, processes is where you really see the difference in results when you're using a memory image versus using a standard collection or a disk image. And really the extra value you're getting out of that is looking at the additional arguments. Generally, we get a lot more details on the arguments that have been collected with those processes that have been run. One of the downsides, since we are not collecting the files off a disk, generally they're coming out of memory, hashing does not work in memory, or it might work every now and then, but basically is extremely unreliable in memory because we don't get necessarily the same file format or same files in a recoverable format within memory as we do on disk. So hashing does not work. And you can see here, we've got some examples where the MemprocFS find evil rules have been applied and have actually come up with some detections. And again, if you go to your analysis results, you're going to see the details on all those. As always, you can also go to the justification and view the full details on why that particular alert or scoring has been applied. Attached devices, another cool thing that we enhanced a fair bit in 3.12 and have now brought on to support memory images as well. You now get a lot more detail on devices that have actually been attached to the system, including your serial numbers and a fair bit of historical information. You can see here, this is a memory image. We're still seeing devices that were connected to the system sort of 12 months ago. So you are getting some good value there. Okay, so I have a question. Will you drop Volatility 2 and or upgrade to Volatility 3 in later versions? Basically, there's licensing issues around moving to Volatility 3. So at this point in time, I would say that is unlikely. We don't have any plans to drop Volatility 2. Obviously, a disadvantage of Volatility 2 is it doesn't have as much support for more modern operating systems. Another nice thing within MemprocFS is you do get a complete view of the file system. And again, this is recreated from what is in memory. Generally, your memory collection is always going to have a certain amount of smear. You start collection at one point in time, you finish collection at another point in time. There is always a risk of data corruption and things. So not going to be as reliable as grabbing the MFT off the disk, but you are still getting what most of the time is going to be a pretty accurate representation of the file system as it was at that time of memory collection. And you can go through and browse all that file system details. Moving on to S3 and Azure. This is something I would say I'm pretty excited about. It's something that I use when we're helping customers out with investigations. And obviously we've had support for S3 and Azure uploads from the collector for quite some time. What we have made, or we've made some changes in the way that's operating, and now you actually have two different accounts configured within Cyber Triage to work with your cloud service. And the reason why we do that is for security. And basically you have a collector account, which is assigned with the minimum permissions, ideally write only, and you have a manager account, which is able to view, read, and download the contents of what's in that bucket or container. It is up to you to create the bucket and the container. We had a fair bit of debate around this as to whether we should be using Cyber Triage to create and set up containers or buckets for you. At the end of the day, even if Cyber Triage is doing that, the permissions and things required to do that is going to be just as much work as just going ahead for you to actually create those containers yourselves. And there's obviously security considerations as well. So the process of setting everything up, create the bucket or the container, create your two accounts, set the permissions on that container for those two accounts. The beauty of most cloud services is you do get a lot of very granular control around those permissions. So you can improve the security. And security aspect of using a cloud service for your upload is pretty significant. And the reason why it's significant is because the collector is running on a potentially compromised host. So no matter how we manage it, at the end of the day, you have the collector running on that potentially compromised host. It needs some credentials to access that cloud storage service. And so potentially those credentials are exposed on the compromised host. Worst case scenario, threat actor still has access to that host, can get those credentials and then gain access to that cloud storage service. So please, when you are using this service, use a dedicated collection account. And we want to minimize, absolutely minimize the permissions of that collector account as much as possible. The ideal scenario is write only, which means the account can upload, but it can't do anything else. So I can upload a file to a container, or that account can upload a file to the container. It can't even see the file that it has just uploaded. It can't delete that file. It can't do anything with that file, and it can't do anything else to that account. So worst case scenario would be a threat actor gets those credentials. They can then turn around and upload additional files to your cloud storage container, but they can't see that they've uploaded anything. They're not going to be able to access them. They're not going to be able to do anything else with them. There is also an option within S3 that you can actually set a time-limited session key that is only valid for a set period of time, which is a great, obviously a bit of extra overhead, management overhead, creating that session key, but it gives you an extra bit of security and saves you going through and changing passwords or deleting accounts and recreating accounts on a regular basis. Certainly changing passwords regularly for these types of accounts is something that we also really strongly recommend. It depends on your environment. Recommendation would be that for each investigation, you are at least resetting the password on that collection account. Okay, a few other questions. Will Cyber Triage be creating any documentation on how to set up S3 Azure? Absolutely. In fact, we already have. And if my memory serves me correctly, on our next slide, here is the documentation. We have screenshots and everything else walking you through that entire process. We have a lot of documentation for S3. Documentation on Azure is a little more challenging because good old Microsoft actually change the level of control you have and your different options depending on what level of licensing you have, which makes it really painful and time consuming drawing up different sets of instructions for all the different scenarios. And honestly, unless you have sort of the top tier licensing with Microsoft, you can't set that write only permission. You can't create your own custom permissions profiles within Azure and for your containers, which then makes this whole process a little more challenging. So my personal recommendation at this point in time is use S3. If you are already have the permissions and everything else on Azure and you have the ability to create that write only account, then by all means do that. Next question, how can we solve the problems, risk, threats in Cyber Triage? I'm assuming there you are talking about the actual collection and sharing those credentials. So I walked through that. That session key is regular changing the password, setting the session key, and setting those write permissions are the sort of three things that we really strongly recommend with that. And Shravam, forgive me, I don't have my glasses on. I think that is your name. If you've got any more questions, just type them in around that if you want more detail on specific things with that S3 side of things. Will there be a memory collection tool included in the collection tool in the future? That is another really good question. To the best of my knowledge, it's not on the roadmap. I'll let some of the other guys chime in if it is. It's certainly something we, I guess, consider every now and then, but at this point in time, there's no specific plans around that. So from within S3,
Hey, Mike, one,
Yep,
one quick thing. Just in the comments about the risks, threats, whatever you kind of question there. If that is about kind of the credentials, I'm not sure you mentioned or not, but one thing that when you configure kind of the manager versus the collector, right, we do certain checks, and we'll let you know that like, hey, your upload account has write permissions, right? This is bad, right? So we kind of do some sanity checks on the credentials you give us, just to kind of prevent some easy mistakes from happening there as well.
absolutely. And that is a really good point. And here we have our sort of configuration options for actually creating those accounts. So you can create multiple profiles. So if you have multiple investigators on your team, or you want to create a profile for every different investigation, or if you're an MSSP and you want to create a profile for each individual customer, that is the sort of thing you can do. And then when you go to create a profile, you're going to see your options, same as they were before. Create an S3 profile or an Azure blob, specify who the provider is. There's a number of other providers that also support S3. So if you're not specifically using Amazon, you can go other and enter in those details. With a bucket, one thing to keep in mind with buckets is that a black bucket is a global identifier. And for the whole world, for the entire. So if you create a bucket in Amazon, then that bucket name is unique to you and will be unique to you basically forever. So if you use a name that is really obvious, then there is the risk also that people are going to start scanning and may identify that bucket. Now, ideally, well, I won't say ideally, you will have set permissions on the bucket so that it's not publicly accessible. But good practice, if you use something like a GUID on your bucket name, it's then going to be a little harder to find for people to identify. And you can see here, we have our two different sets of credentials. We have our collector upload credential, access key, secret access key, and also a session token. Now, a session token is optional. I did mention that. But if you actually go into your bucket configuration, you can set a temporary session token so that in order to access that bucket, they will need the access key ID, the secret access key, and the session token. And the session token will expire after a given amount of time. That is a good, secure way of doing things to ensure that the credentials that you've made, put out there are going to expire after whatever time you choose. The manager role, and again, they need read permissions. If you go into the documentation, we go through the minimal set of permissions that are needed to be configured for both of these roles. And as Brian mentioned, we have the option there to test a profile. And when you go and test a profile, actually it's not an option. You have to test a profile before you go ahead and sort of complete the setup. But part of that profile test is a little bit of sanity checking to make sure there's nothing really obvious that, hey, you've given, full control of this bucket to the collector, or the collector has too many permissions. Okay, I'm not a lawyer, but I've hung around them for too long. And I would say that we're not accepting responsibility for the way you configure your bucket. And we're not guaranteeing that you run test profile and that guarantees that your bucket is totally secure. That is your responsibility, but we are doing some sanity checking there for you to make sure that there's nothing obviously wrong with it. Once your collection, so once you've created that collector, same as you did previously, you deploy the cloud config file with the collector, it uploads everything to S3, and now what you can do, it's simply a matter of adding a host. So you go to choose to add a Cyber Triage file from within Cyber Triage, exactly as you did before. And what you'll see, if you go to Cloud Storage File and select that option, you'll see all your different profiles here, and you'll see a list of all the files that are actually in the bucket. And you can then just go through and select those and add them to Cyber Triage. Cyber Triage will then download them and kick off the regular ingest for you. On the malware scanning side, we've also done or made a number of changes. I shouldn't say changes, I should say improvements. So imp hash uploads are available for offline or air-gapped systems. Previously, we had sort of the hash upload was available for offline systems, although the regular MD5 hash upload was available, and now imp hash is also available. We've also added, and this is something that I think is a really nice feature, or a couple of really nice features. On the right-click option, you can upload any collected file for malware analysis. So you've run your collection, there is a file there, maybe a zip file, for example, that is, you're not quite sure what's in it. You don't want to open it up yourself. You want to send it up to the sandbox, or you'll send it off for analysis, because it's a zip file. Cyber Triage is not going to automatically run the malware analysis on that. You can now just right click and send it off for analysis. Another feature when it comes to disk images is you can now select absolutely any file from the disk image, irrespective of one that is normally collected, and it will then go through and analyze it. We've also provided full access to the recorded future malware report. I'll show you some screenshots of that shortly, and also the ability to exclude specific directories from malware scanning. So if you are managing your environment and you know there's one application that is always triggering alerts and generating a lot of noise when you're doing your analysis, then you can go through and say, yep, we don't want to hear anything from this particular directory, and that will then be avoided. The other scenario we see that getting used is some customers have maybe pen testing teams that are developing their own tools, and they don't want those tools getting exposed to the wider world, and so we can exclude those directories for that reason as well. So the right-click option, this example here, I'm selecting an rclone.conf file. That's not something that in a real world you'd likely to want to send for analysis, but you now have that option. So if you do have threat actors changing file extensions and that sort of thing, or using different obfuscation methods to try and conceal files, you can now send it. And the upload to cybertriage.com is going to do the hash analysis, uploading it to, I was going to say Recorded Future Reversing Labs, or you can send it through to the Recorded Future Sandbox. In terms of excluding paths from scanning, you go to the options under malware analysis, and you now have this tab here showing excluded paths, and you can choose which paths you want to exclude from your analysis. With the sandbox report, what you're actually getting, we now have an option of the summary report, which is basically the key facts that we're pulling out of that report, what we think is most relevant to you. Or you have options to go to the detailed report, and that detailed report is going to show you as much information has been collected by the sandbox for the different types of analysis it has done. So just as a quick reminder, when you are running or submitting a file to the sandbox, it's running it in a Windows 7 system, it's running it in a Windows 10 system, it's also doing a static analysis. And in this particular view, you can see the breakdowns for each of those. In our summary reports, you can actually scroll through down and see that as well. There is, depending on the sample, depending on the analysis, there may be a few bits and pieces of information that are available to you in the sort of detailed report that don't come through into the summary report. Quick question, is it possible to encrypt the uploaded files automatically from security GDPR perspective? We do have the option to encrypt collection files. So you could pass that as an argument to the collector when you're running it. So yes. Just don't ask me the exact options right now. So back, in terms of the UI and the search, in 3.12, you would have noticed that we sort of changed the way we display some of the progress information as data is getting ingested and processed. We've broken that out a little bit more, actually swapped the status and analysis task buttons around. There is now a view tasks button which will show you what's actually, more detail on what's running in the background. So at the moment, we have an ingestion running. At the moment, it is kicking off the initial ingestion. If I want to go view tasks, I might see, okay, we're now at step 5 of 13 of the processing that particular collection. And you can go back and forth. Useful if you do have something that's running long and you want to know, is it still progressing? Are things still moving? You can go through and have a look at that. Other change is we've moving the MITRE attack framework information a bit more front and center. So now under item details, you will see any related MITRE attack links, and these links take you to the MITRE site, so you can then dive in and check up on those and get a bit more detail. I actually find this is quite useful because the MITRE details often do give you a bit more context around what's been detected, and maybe why something has been scored as malicious or bad. We also have an option or a button to open files directly in the text editor on your system. So from the strings view, when you're viewing the file, you go to your strings view, you can just click open in editor, and that will launch the default editor on your system, and you can view that file directly. This is something I have been bugging the guys a little bit about for a while. Some of the other stuff we have going on in Teams, or the team version, we have more audit logging going on, so you can see when people have logged in, logged out, all their session activity and everything else. JSON files can be split based on size, so if you have size limits on upload containers, Dropboxes, etc., you can specify that we don't want that collection file to be any larger than 2 gigabytes or 5 gigabytes or whatever. Hopefully you don't have too many collections that are running over 5 gigabytes. Another important feature is that we've changed our scoring to use the actual NTFS file name attribute for time. And the reason why we've done this is we find, a lot of time files are, say, unpacked from an archive. If the archive and the timestamps within the archive are very old, then the modified times also reflect what was saved within the archive. And I'm in the process of writing an article on how that all works. And I promise I'm not going to start diving down that rabbit hole. But it's really bizarre the different ways those timestamps get manipulated depending on how it's unpacked from the archive. We found the file name time is a really good representation of when the file was really unpacked or placed on the system, or the file name timestamps. So they're the ones that we're using for any sort of time-based scoring and anything open within the last or placed on the file system, for example, the last 30 days is going to be using that timestamp because it is a bit more reliable. So in terms of what we're doing for 3.14, what we're currently working on, looking at improving the timeline, making it a little bit more, and kind of points 1 and 2 kind of link in a little bit, working on making it easier for you to go through and filter out some of the noise and find the stuff that is really significant, and looking at that within both the context of the timeline and also search updates. Looking at more application level. So this is, Cyber Triage at the moment, I think, does a fantastic job at the operating system level. We're looking at, okay, what are some of the applications that people are frequently seeing and things we want to provide support around on that. One other feature request we get fairly regularly is for people that are monitoring a known environment, the ability to create a baseline collection, a baseline image that they can use to say, okay, this is seen, this is part of our known good system. We don't want to see any alerts or any scores related to these known good from within our environment. And basically set it up so you can run that collection and then not have to be alerted about anything from that known good image. And then some more sort of different ways to filter, carve up what you're seeing on the bad and suspicious items. So that pretty much wraps it up there. I think I got to all the questions. I'll just actually go into the chat and see. We've only got stuff from Cyber Triage there. I don't know, Brian, Austin, did I miss anyone? Oh, there we go. Will there be an option for continuous monitoring in the future? I'm going to wimp out on that one and pass it along to Brian.
There's my camera. There's my camera. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, this was another one we talked about a bunch. And we can certainly love to have a call with you to kind of follow up more on that, right? We go on various kind of discussions on this with kind of usually discussions around. There's probably a longer answer than you're looking for, with the basic idea of at the end of the day, are we going to recreate Sysmon? Kind of watching a bunch of things and or recreating EDR to always be doing kind of monitoring. So partly what we're looking at is obviously there's a need for after suspicious of an endpoint to keep on monitoring it. Some of our questions that we're trying to map out is are how many places are deploying EDRs to those, and the goal here is leverage EDR as a collector. How many places are deploying Sysmon after that, and the goal is we leverage Sysmon data. So I would say we are certainly looking into making sure that you all can get continuous data after you're suspicious of things. The question usually comes around like, who's doing the watching? Is it us? Is it Sysmon? Is it EDR? And so if you have specific use cases where you think it should be us versus like a Sysmon or EDR, we should certainly we should start chat so we can follow with you after this. So.
I think that is it. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for
Yeah.
giving us a bit of your time. And once again, actually, one other really important thing. Any questions? Please send questions through to support@sleuthkitlabs.com. We are in the process of, phasing out or getting everyone on our team using the same email domain. So support@sleuthkitlabs.com. If you do support@cybertriage.com, they'll still come to us and they'll still get through. But we are transitioning to everyone using sleuthkitlabs.com. And wrap it up there.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everyone.
All right.